Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMake and I'm a senior editor with the Mises Institute, and joining me is Tho Bishop, my associate editor. And this week we're going to talk a little bit about the Electoral College. You would have thought that maybe with the Dems having won this time around, members of the left would stop demanding that the Electoral College be eliminated now that the world has been returned to normal and a Democrat has seemingly won. Well, that's not the case. Apparently now the fact that there's a long drawn-out tail to the election and there's still a chance that Trump could in fact win in the Electoral College is now evidence that it has to still be abolished. And we've seen new columns for that in a variety of publications, including The Week and in a variety of local newspapers. And apparently the memo went out that we're still not done with trying to get rid of the Electoral College. And of course, some states have also entered into this multi-state compact, which is supposed to award the state's Electoral College votes to whichever candidate wins the popular vote. So the demand is everything would be free and smooth and easy if only we did the popular vote now. The reality, of course, is historically it's really the Electoral College that makes close elections look more like landslides, and this idea that the Electoral College complicates things really isn't historically the case. But for now, it seems that at least the short-term agenda is get rid of the Electoral College. But if I might take you back to ancient history, which was, say, about 2015, 2016, before the election, I seem to remember a time when the Electoral College was thought to favor the Dems. Tho, do you remember this?
Yes, the blue wall, this, particularly after, I think, the Obama election 2008. And of course, so often as the case, whenever people start talking about how a party has established themselves where they will never be challenged again, the 2002 midterms during the Bush years, right, where they had this incredible win with the House, which you normally don't have after you've won the presidency. You had Karl Rove and Fox News was saying the narrative that, the Republicans are going to be in a permanent majority from there on out. You have the same thing after the Obama election, because the idea was that, well, if you have the West Coast, you have the Northeast, and you have Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and these things that seem to be firmly blue areas, that the math for the Electoral College made it so that a Republican Party would never be able to win the White House again. And of course, if you put up candidates like Mitt Romney, that would probably very well been the case. Trump, when he was able to really make those inroads within the Midwest, that changed the entire formula. And this is, again, the interesting political realignment that we're seeing with the GOP becoming a working class party, contrasting with the more kind of a combination of the elite, particularly college education being one of the major driving factors, and some of the there's certain demographics that are still kind of strongly within the Democratic camp. It has completely remade politics where, again, talking about the Obama era, you might as well be talking about the 1950s these days.
Well, and one of the other criticisms that we're seeing of the Electoral College right now is because twice in the last 20 years, the candidate who lost the popular vote won the election. And we're talking about 2000 and again in 2016. Now, Bush won rather comfortably in 2004, and then Obama won comfortably in both 2008 and 2012. But the fact that you could win so often, apparently, in the Electoral College, but not with the popular vote, is really a throwback to the late 19th century, because the 20th century just really didn't have much of that sort of thing at all. But really, that is less an indictment of the Electoral College, it seems to me, than really an alarm bell for the overall presidential system and the nation overall, because what that really indicates is that the U.S. is deeply divided and has serious problems if one's goal is to maintain these people into a single polity. Now, I mentioned the late 19th century. This was a country that was coming out of a civil war where people were deeply divided, where people in the North felt that Southerners were traitors, where there was a lot of conflict over Catholics and prohibition, and people in the Democratic Party were regularly denounced as just a bunch of traitors and drunks and papists and so on. These were not friendly times in the country. And so we saw a similar situation with the Electoral College. And so this idea that getting rid of that and just relying on the popular vote will make all of our problems go away seems to me rather naive. And the reality is the winner in 2016 was able to win because he extended his appeal beyond just a couple of regions. The fact that someone can win in the Electoral College but lose in the popular vote suggests to us that the winner of the popular vote is very popular in certain places, but isn't able to really break out of those places, i.e. the Northeast and the West Coast, and have broader appeal. Whereas Trump was able to have broader appeal beyond just the old solid South. He was able to, as you said, get into the Midwest and, of course, rely on support from the Western U.S. as well. So will the Dems then really be able to play well in this idea that as long as the Electoral College is there, you've got to get some votes in places out of your core regions, which is the coasts? Now, I know plenty of pessimists who think, well, the Dems are about to take over every state and they're going to win anyway. And we'll actually get to that in this episode. But will adopting the popular vote now just get everybody into line, and now everything's going to be free and smooth and easy, and you don't even have to bother extending your appeal beyond just a couple of places?
Well, I definitely think that there's a lot of people who fantasize about what could America look like if we had one party rule, and there has been a drumbeat like, if we take away these pesky little inconveniences that the American system has, the Electoral College, the Senate, these things that were built to try to protect, ensure that a political minority doesn't completely get steamrolled. Oh, think of how efficient our government would be, right? Again, I always think about that line from Thomas Friedman, who, again, by no means a radical, right? Mr. Boring New York Times. 2008, saying, just imagine what we could do if America was just resembled China for a day. And he would just think about all the possibilities. We could solve global warming just like that. And there is a fetish from a lot of people that, and again, not particularly revolutionaries, about what that would look like. What's interesting, though, is that when we think about the inevitability, right, of the Democrats, things like that, if we simply focus on the presidential election, I think it can blind us to some of the larger trends going on, because and this is one of the things that makes the 2020 election so weird, is that at the same time where Trump lost states that he won in 2016, sometimes by larger margins in 2016, the Republicans did great. I mean, this includes in city areas. For one, Trump himself significantly improved his vote turnout in New York City, in LA, in these high density city areas. Not enough to flip them, of course, but he made major gains in these solid blue states, or cities in solid blue states. That reflected on state house races. That reflected in congressional races. The GOP flipped 4 seats in California, the most of any state out there this year. A state like New Hampshire, as we mentioned last week, Republicans won over 100 seats there. So again, these political trends, if we don't simply, because they matter too, because it's a way of measuring trends beyond simply the electoral vote, but again, showing regional differences. So again, even that narrative, of the cities being untouchable by a conservative audience, when you consider that the breakdown is increasingly about working class versus different sort of economic spheres playing off against each other, rather than say other things that would be the geographical differences, right, of the South versus the North. Things are a lot more complicated now, and that again, it's the idea that these differences go away if you simply take away, make the Senate more democratic, make the Electoral College go away. I think it's a lot of wishful thinking on the part of the left.
Well, that's a good point, and something to note also with these claims that if only we did it by the popular vote, there wouldn't be all these lawsuits and it would be just really clear who won. Well, it's important to keep in mind, building on what you're saying, is that a big reason that the victories are so solid in places like California or Massachusetts and so on is that Republican presidents don't campaign there because they figure, well, the state's going to award its electoral college votes anyway to my opponent, so I'm going to put all of my resources into other places where it's a closer vote or it's a swing state, right? But if it were just a popular vote, then Trump would have spent a lot more time campaigning in places like LA, in places like Massachusetts. He would have had his surrogates out there making promises, meeting with voters and local influential people to actually get votes in those places. And you would have ended up with much closer votes in a lot of areas within places like California or Virginia or Massachusetts and so on. And what that means then is that if you've got a lot of close votes in a lot of places, well, then if it's a close election, you've got an endless number of lawsuits. Because thanks to the Electoral College, the number of lawsuits is greatly limited by the number of states where the vote is actually close and where it might make a difference to actually sue. But if now all precincts are basically equal and every vote counts equally, well, then you might as well just keep suing forever. And the stability argument doesn't follow at all from the arguments being made about the Electoral College. And as you note, there would be a totally different dynamic because there would be an appeal to actually win San Diego County, for example, rather than just ignore it.
Well, and it's interesting this year. I mean, the one area of the country that had the hardest time counting ballots. Again, as a Floridian, anytime that I can make fun of another state not being able to do their elections properly, I'll take it for national pride. There is New York. New York City was still counting. I mean, it was you had AOC like doing press conference saying like, if this was a swing state, like this would be the biggest outrage in America. And it should have been. Like it was. They were counting ballots. It made Nevada look efficient. And imagine if we were at a popular like that would suddenly become like, because nobody's questioning New York. In fact, hey, if the Texas Attorney General out there, which is just put out a very interesting lawsuit over states like Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, changing some of their rules in the middle of the contest, and the idea being that states that played it right, like Texas, like Florida, Louisiana's on that lawsuit. I think Alabama just joined it. The idea being that, okay, we did our things properly. You have these states that were mucking it up. We all have to live with the consequences of them, and therefore it's not fair that we have to be penalized for these states not doing their jobs right. The very interesting lawsuit. We'll see how it proceeds. I'm skeptical of any legal outcome here for Trump, but it's an interesting argument. They should put New York on that list, because how in the world can you trust a state that can't count their ballots any more efficiently? Again, no question about the actual, who would have won that state. But if you can't run that process right, that goes as much to questions of legitimacy as much as anything. Again, obviously, the idea, the fetish that, simply casting ballots is what legitimizes political power. Again, there's plenty of countries in the world that I do not think that the Democrats here making that argument would view. These are the same people that often cheerlead for revolutions in these states because, we can't trust the elections over there.
Well, this takes us to the philosophical basis of the Electoral College then. Maybe we should step back a little bit and talk about that, especially for foreigners or anyone who's not paying attention, right? Why is there this Electoral College? Now, you get a lot of simpleton answers about this, right? Like, the Constitution says it, so it must be good. Or My favorite, well, it's a republic, not a democracy. That's why we have the Electoral College. Well, of course, that phrase explains absolutely nothing. In fact, we could get rid of the Electoral College and the United States would absolutely still be a republic using the definition of James Madison and those other people who talked about the whole Republican thing. So that's not a very helpful explanation. The philosophical issue here is that you have to remember that the United States is supposed to be thought of as a confederation of member states. This is what was the idea in the 18th century. It was recognized that all of these independent governments could not be held together except by highly despotic forces of military power. And so short of that, which was a power nobody in the United States had at the time, they were going to have to find some way to get all of these states to agree to be members and find some way to balance their power so that the states didn't feel immediately that they were in the permanent majority and had permanent minority and felt that they really had no power in what became Washington. So the idea is then that we take the small states and we still give them some sort of reason to still be in the U.S. and a reason to feel that they still have some influence, even though they would be dominated by the large states. And that's what the Electoral College tries to do. It balances out the smaller, weaker states with the stronger, larger, more populous states. And so that the presidency isn't seen as just simply the purview of the big states. Now, you should think of it then as you might think of, say, Europe and the European Union. If we just allowed, if they had a presidential system similar to ours and they just had a straight up popular vote for it, well, whoever manages to win in a small handful of the large countries, France, Italy, Spain, if the UK were in there, that also in Germany, then they would always just pick the president, and the smaller member states would just basically be out of luck if they had different views. And the same thing would happen in the United States. You could have really about a dozen states with a couple hangers-on that would choose the president every time. So the way to think about it conceptually is that the United States is a group of member states, not just this one country. Now, the anti-EC philosophy is that America is this thing, it's this country, and whoever votes in the majority wins, and that reflects the will of America, whatever that means. We call this magic. This is what a lot of democratic theory relies upon, at least in the more naive views. And you could see that whole one man, one vote philosophy where that takes you. That takes us to where the New York Times was back advocating for the Baltic states to forever remain within Russia because well, Lithuanians could vote for their preferred leader. Of course, what we all know is that Lithuanians would be outvoted forever and always be ruled by whatever was good, by people who favored whatever was good for Russia. And the same would be true in the United States. The people in the smaller states would forever be ruled by the people who who did whatever was best for California and New York State, and so on. So that's why it's a fairly fragile system. And this is covered by F.H. Buckley a little bit in his American Secession book, in that it's a delicate balancing act, in fact. But you could have other systems that weren't really necessarily the popular vote. You could do something where it was along the lines of the state delegation majorities. This is what happens if the election gets thrown into the House of Representatives, where each state has a vote for president based on who has a majority within their congressional delegations. That's one way to do it. And if you actually do the math, it's still a very close election. It looks like it favors Trump, but only slightly. It looks like it would change really only a couple of states. It would change Georgia and Wisconsin, and flip Iowa, I believe, from the Republicans to the Dems based on that stand. This is based on among your members of Congress, which party has the majority and the most Congress members. And if we did it based on that, where they all met in the House and each state cast a vote, it looks like Trump would win, but barely, not by landslide by any means. And so there's other ways of doing it. The important thing is to keep in mind that the whole point was to basically prevent civil war by giving weaker states a stake in the larger presidential system. But it looks like now the idea is to remove that stake and to just tell the smaller states, tough luck. And this seems to be the way the left functions nowadays is, well, we've got the votes, so too bad. We're not interested in any sort of compromise. And if you don't like it, well, tough, we have the nuclear bombs, so there's nothing you can do, to paraphrase, I believe, Eric Swalwell, the congressman who said that we'll take away your guns and there's nothing you can do about it because we have nuclear missiles. So that seems to be the philosophy at the moment, and I'm not sure that's really a good recipe for a lasting formula, however.
Well, considering that Eric Swalwell was just exposed as being, when I think it was a 5-year relationship with a Chinese spy, perhaps his interests are not exactly America first at heart. Yeah, I mean, these people are dopes. I mean, like we cannot, there's no defense of it. I mean, these are people that have grown up believing that the secret of democracy is, okay, you get numbers, right? Like that's the American Union is simply about raw power, and raw power can be dictated by numbers. And so therefore they think if you eliminate the Electoral College, you eliminate these checks, then, we're going to rule in all of these places of the country that they look down upon, that they despise, are going to just have to get in line. And if you eliminate the Electoral College and you create a system where it's a pure popular vote with major population centers dictating policy, then that's going to accelerate the lack of loyalty and lack of trust that you have, already that has massively expanded given this unique political environment the last 10 years. And so while, I think there are some very interesting, the outcomes that we've had throughout American history where the House of Representatives have made this choice. Obviously, you had it with the famous Jefferson Burr election. You had it with the Samuel Tilden election with Rutherford Hayes. They're allowing congressional representation kind of. The interesting thing, again, as the Rutherford Hayes Samuel Tilden election shows, trusting congressmen to when they have larger political ambitions than you typically get from like your average Electoral College representative. And there's ways of making deals there that there could be some potential arguments in favor of it, right? Like if you were typically corruption in politics is very petty and self-serving, but like in the Rutherford Hayes election, one of the bargaining chips that were used to get Southern Democrat buy-in to the Republican side of things was the removal of troops. Now, Samuel Tilden was running in favor of that, but so there was a Republican candidate willing to make policy compromises. And I think the removal of Southern troops is something we'd all celebrate here, as we don't support occupied territories. That's an example where a backroom deal and that actually kind of played out to made the Republican Party perhaps slightly less worse than it would have been if Rutherford Hayes would have won an outstanding vote on its own right. But again, the larger thing here, though, is that again these people think about politics as simply getting the numbers at the end of the day, failing to take into account that what really is the governing mechanisms of this country. I mean, I know it's come up on multiple podcasts now. It is less about the Constitution, it's less about the letter of the law. It is really about unwritten political norms that, there is a belief that you are dealing with upright actors. And again, I think wrongly so, right? This is where a lot of Rothbard's kind of populist stuff comes up to, is that, we need to stop looking at these people as, noble caretakers of the Union and people that have our best interests at heart. But these mechanisms are in place to try to help foster that trust. And once you remove that, once you start actively going to war with these norms, then the shakeup there is a lack of faith with the populace to have believing in the integrity of these political bonds. And again, you're already seeing this play out right now. Again, with all the polling out there, if you have 40+% of the American population that refuses to believe that this election was legitimately done, and there's some estimates that it's even higher than that, then even with all the safeguards in place to try to protect regional differences and all that, if the people simply say, I'm sorry, I don't buy it, there are real consequences. And again, it is entertaining to see all of these very, elite blue check marks on Twitter, mocking this stuff, mocking people, the Trump areas that are not believing the legitimacy of Biden. I think it was Michael Malice that made the point that, the same people, these are the same people that, Hillary Clinton had no plan in 2008 after New Hampshire because she was going to win Iowa, New Hampshire, and after that it was just going to be a snowball effect. And it wasn't until Obama kind of really shook things up that she realized, oh well, I need a plan after that date. Same thing here. The left saw the election date as the time that they were going to be done with Trump, and they didn't have a plan on dealing with Trump America after that. Well, guess what? It's not going to go as smoothly as they think, and the consequences there. Again, as people that legitimately fear the power that the executive branch has, as people that legitimately despise what the federal government has become, as people that are genuine enemies of the American empire and its current state, that lack of faith is far better than any electoral outcome, because that gets directly to the point of where does political legitimacy really lie in a nation when people no longer have faith in their alleged political betters. And that's why this is such an interesting time right now.
Right. It's fun to watch the demand that everyone accept that stability is the most important thing, and that we all just, after the election, we all recognize that some journalism majors working at some news company are the ones who decide who's president. And then we all immediately fall into line. And then, of course, the usual predictable, oh, it's a threat to national security, right? This is the perennial war cry, the person who wants everyone just to shut up. Hey, shut up, America. You're threatening national security. So just let the big boys in Washington do whatever they want. And because otherwise the Chinese will come and enslave you, or you'll all be speaking Russian, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just the same old playbook over and over again. But yeah, it's a pretty predictable division, right? You've got the Trump people in flyover country who are real skeptical of the outcome, but everyone whose career has been based on success and power in Washington, D.C. wants everything to just calm down and go back to normal. And everyone just accept whatever it is that MSNBC said about who's president now. Now, no matter whether or not one thinks that there was fraud, the fact is the House of Representatives is who decides the president, not someone working at the editorial desk in New York somewhere for some newspaper. But absolutely, you're all just supposed to get in line, and we're supposed to pretend that there aren't these real political fissures within the United States, which, if ignored, could lead to real problems.
It's interesting. I brought up earlier the fact that you have many people on the left, that would love nothing more than for our government to kind of better resemble China. Well, today, YouTube put out some new, because it's been interesting, as the Mises Institute has recently learned, right, when they took down a Tom Woods video. YouTube is creating all sorts of new, very serious categories on things that, they apply an even harsher hand on content. And the first step with this was COVID. This is why they took down Tom Woods' video, in spite of the fact that there was nothing there that was, he was not. It was ridiculous, right? There was, and it's interesting because they also left the two other Tom Woods videos on the same topic. Neither here nor there. I know one of the issues that YouTube had was, how dare you question? You can't question the effectiveness of lockdowns. Like, well, the WHO, also questioning the effectiveness of lockdowns. Not exactly the strongest entity out there pushing back on the China narrative. Neither here nor there. But today, they have a new category. YouTube does that. Oh well, any video that questions the legitimacy of this election is now going to go down the YouTube rabbit hole. Well, again, this is exactly the sort of stuff that, again, the protesters in Hong Kong were questioning the legitimacy of the Hong Kong government, whether the Hong Kong government represented the interests of the population they represented, or whether or not they were serving the ends of Beijing. I think we know the answer to that. And so now what you have is the left has been perfectly willing to allow these corporate monoliths full of staffers that happen to be Kamala Harris in particular alumni to do the censorship that the CCP has been able to rely on. Again, many of these same tech companies actually in their own country get all of it to try to suppress any of this dissonant thought out there. Well, again, guess what? These you can censor YouTube. The people aren't going away. The people don't trust YouTube anymore. The people don't trust even Fox News anymore. And again, and all of this actually is a wonderful infomercial for right now as our end of the year push. The premium that we have if anyone renews their Mises membership, $5 a month, great deal. You can get, it was a wonderful mini book by Jeff Deist on this very topic. This is something that he's been hitting on for years now, on the question of how do you deal with politically vanquished people? They don't go away. How did we get to the place where we are right now? And it's a great talk. So on this topic, if you become a member of the Mises Institute, we've got more content for you on this very, very issue.
Well, that's an important issue. Is big democracies like the United States, which is a huge democracy, is by far the only democracy of its size. Now, yes, I get it. America's a republic, but among political systems with elections that have representative legislatures and so on, the United States is by far the largest, unless you include India, and I don't think that's really a model that anybody wants to base much of anything on. And so what we find then is you've got a much higher potential for minority groups to be within that. And by that, I don't necessarily mean ethnic or racial minority. I mean minority groups of any kind, ideological, economic, regional, and so on. And large democracies of that sort really only work when you don't have a situation where there is an aggrieved permanent minority. And that is really just that politically conquered people, if you will. Right? Once you've got that, once you've got a group of people who feel that they have no chance of getting back into power, that usually and very often will lead to violence. Now, it might not lead to open warfare. It could lead to terrorist-type acts. It could just lead to long, simmering problems. And lots of people think that when you say stuff like this, what I mean is that next week somebody's going to found a militia and start shelling Washington, D.C. That's not what I'm implying at all. However, groups that purport to be representative of their people, states like the United States, they tend to fail beyond the short term if they just have half the country that feels that it's being dominated by 51% in the other half. And that really is the essence then of the Electoral College. It's not important because somebody wrote it on an old piece of parchment, and it's not important because the courts say so. It's really about political compromise, and if you just ignore it, that at least in the medium and long term starts to have some significant problems. So I think we'll have to leave it at that. We just wanted to cover it a little bit because it's not going away, apparently. Apparently, even if the Dems win, we're not supposed to be satisfied with the Electoral College because it allegedly disenfranchises people, whatever that means, based on their idiosyncratic definition of voting. But we'll be back next week with another topic, and until then, have a wonderful week.